People are afraid of bears, wolves, or bad weather when camping. But after that night, I realized that the most dangerous thing in the forest is not wild animals. Because in some places, the thing watching you is neither an animal nor a human. It just waits. And by the time you notice it, it's already too late. I was 22 years old when this happened, and for the first time in my life, I had planned a 3-day camping trip with my friends. Back then, I thought it would just be a fun weekend. But after what we experienced that night, only 4 out of the 5 of us returned home. And to this day, none of us can talk about that incident comfortably. My name is Jason Miller. This incident took place in September 2022. We were in college and we decided to go camping together one last time before classes started. There were 5 of us: myself, my childhood friend Ryan, my cousin Kevin, Liam, whom I met at university, and Liam's close friend Noah. The most experienced camper among us was Ryan. He had been going to the mountains with his father since childhood and knew how to read maps, build campfires, and find directions well. We all relied on his experience. Our destination was a camping spot near an old lake that very few people on the internet knew about. It wasn't an official camping area. Ryan said he had discovered the place years ago with his father. There were no settlements for miles around. There was almost no phone signal. The nearest paved road was about an hour away. For us, this seemed ideal for getting away from the noise of the city and spending 3 days in complete peace. We set out early in the morning. The weather was clear. Music was playing in the car. We were all joking around and talking about our future plans. After driving for about 3 hours, the asphalt ended and we continued on a dirt road. The road was getting narrower and narrower. Trees covered both sides of the car. Sunlight could barely pass through the branches. About 40 minutes later, Ryan stopped the car and said we had to walk from there. We took our bags and entered the forest. About 20 minutes later, the trees thinned out and a small, calm lake appeared before us. The scenery was magnificent. The surface of the water was as calm as a mirror. The surroundings were completely silent. There was no sound of cars, nor any sign of humans. It was as if our entire connection to the world had been severed. We set up our tents by the lake. Until noon, we gathered firewood, prepared a campfire, and tried to catch fish. The first day was going perfectly. As the sun set, we sat around the campfire and started telling scary stories. Kevin joked that strange things always happen in forests like this. We all laughed. Ryan, however, shook his head seriously and said, "The most important rule in the forest is this: if you hear a whistling sound at night, do not answer." Noah laughed, thinking it was just another scary story. Ryan didn't laugh at all. He said his father always instructed him to do this. No matter who it is, no matter what you hear, do not answer a whistle coming from the forest at night. We considered it an old hunter's superstition and changed the subject. Around 12 o'clock, we all retired to our tents. I was staying in the same tent as Ryan. Since we were tired, we fell asleep quickly. I don't know what time of night it was, but I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't understand why I had woken up, then I heard it. A whistling sound coming from afar. It was very faint. It was heard once, then it stopped. A few seconds later again. This time a little closer. Ryan had also woken up. He immediately turned toward me. He didn't say anything. He just put his finger to his lips. He signaled me to be quiet. The whistle was heard a 3rd time. This time it sounded as if it was coming from the other side of the lake. Suddenly, Noah's voice came from the neighboring tent. "Who's out there?" Ryan closed his eyes tightly and whispered in a very quiet voice. I wish he hadn't said that. After the words Ryan whispered, such a silence fell inside the tent that I could hear my own breathing. He slowly lowered his head and fixed his eyes on the entrance of the tent. I, on the other hand, couldn't understand why Noah simply replying to a whistle was so important. A few seconds passed. Nothing happened. Then the whistle was heard again. This time it was different from before. It was no longer coming from afar. It felt like it was coming from right between our tents. Once. Then silence again. Suddenly Noah spoke again. "If you're joking, it's not funny at all." This time, anger could be heard in his voice. Ryan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "I'm going outside," I said. He immediately grabbed my arm. "No, why?" he answered. "To whom?" Ryan was silent for a few seconds. "I don't know." This answer made me even more anxious, because Ryan was usually someone who could find an explanation for everything. Now there was something even he didn't know. The sound of a snapping twig came from outside the tent very slowly, as if someone was walking cautiously, then a second one, then a third. The footsteps were coming from the direction of the campfire. I cautiously opened the zipper of the tent a few centimeters. Ryan tried to stop it, but it was too late. I looked outside. The campfire had gone out long ago. Even though the moonlight was dim, the tents could be made out. Kevin's tent was in place, Liam's too, but someone was standing in front of Noah's tent. At first, I thought it was Ryan. Then I realized Ryan was right next to me. That silhouette wasn't moving. It was just looking at Noah's tent. Its height was very tall. It looked much taller than a normal human. It was impossible to make out its face. It was as if darkness itself covered its face. I held my breath. A few seconds later, that silhouette slowly turned its head toward our tent. At that exact moment, Ryan zipped the tent fully shut. He pushed me back. "It saw you." He said these words so quietly, as if he didn't even want to hear them himself. I got frustrated. Didn't answer. He was just listening. Footsteps started outside, slow, heavy. It was coming from the campfire toward our tent. Every step sounded as if it was compressing the dirt. Thud, thud, thud. Then the sound stopped right in front of our tent. Inside, we were afraid to even breathe. Suddenly, a light touch came against the thin fabric of the tent, as if someone was slowly running their fingers over the tent. It started from the right side. It went up. Then it moved to the other side. The creaking sound of the fabric is still in my ears. Ryan had his eyes closed. He whispered, "Whatever you do, don't speak." A few seconds later, that touch stopped. I thought everything was over, but at that exact moment, Noah's voice came from right behind the tent. "Jason." I froze. Ryan immediately shook his head. "That's not Noah." The voice came again, this time clearer. "Jason, come out. I'm here." Voice was Noah's voice, down to the smallest tone. But there was something strange. Noah's tent was on the opposite side of our tent, yet this voice was coming from behind. Ryan said in a low voice, "Don't listen." I could no longer understand what was happening. A few seconds later, we heard Kevin scream from afar. It was the kind of scream a person hears only once in a lifetime. And immediately after, dozens of whistles rose simultaneously from deep within the forest. Kevin's scream pierced through the night, and the dozens of whistles that rose right after engulfed the entire forest. None of those sounds were coming from the same direction. It was as if they had surrounded us from all sides. Without a moment's hesitation, Ryan unzipped the tent and grabbed my arm, pulling me outside. "We have to find Kevin, but whatever happens, don't enter the forest alone," he said. When we stepped out, the moonlight was weakly reflecting on the lake. The campfire was completely out, and a strange, rotten smell mixed with damp earth was in the air. Liam had also come out of his tent, the fear clear on his face. Noah was standing at the entrance of his tent, looking around like someone who didn't understand what was happening. "Where is Kevin?" he shouted. No one answered. The four of us turned on our flashlights and started looking in the direction the sound had come from. Fresh footprints were visible in the dirt. At first I thought they belonged to Kevin, but Ryan knelt down, looked closely, and his face turned pale. "These prints are not footprints from shoes," he said. I also approached. There were prints resembling human feet in the dirt, but the toes were excessively long and the heel part was almost non-existent. It was as if that thing walked on the front part of its feet. Noah laughed nervously and said it belonged to some animal. Ryan shook his head. "I've been in this forest many times. I've never seen such prints." Right at that moment, a flashlight beam appeared far away among the trees. The light flickered once, then appeared again. Liam shouted joyfully, "Kevin!" There was no answer. The light began to move slowly deeper into the forest. Noah rushed after it without hesitation. Liam and I instinctively wanted to go after him, but Ryan shouted and stopped us. "Stop!" If it were Kevin, he would call out to us. But Noah could no longer hear us. He vanished among the trees. Ryan cursed and was forced to run after him. Liam and I followed them so as not to leave them alone. The inside of the forest was many times darker than it appeared from beside the tents. The flashlights only illuminated a distance of a few meters. Branches hit our faces from every direction. The whistling sounds, however, had suddenly stopped completely. This silence was even more terrifying than the previous sounds. After running for about 5 minutes, we saw Noah. He had frozen in place. Ryan reached him and grabbed his shoulder. Noah pointed with his trembling finger to the clearing ahead. I turned my flashlight in that direction and my breath caught. Among the trees was an old campsite, very old. The fabric of the tents had rotted away. Rusted gas canisters were halfway buried in the dirt. In the center, where the campfire used to be, there was no ash, only black, damp soil. It looked as if no one had set foot there for years. But the strangest thing was a wooden sign standing in the middle of the camp. A sentence was written on it in faded letters, "Whistle back and you stay." As soon as Ryan read that writing, his face went white. I asked him what it meant. He didn't answer, he just whispered, "We need to get out of here immediately." At that exact moment, a whistling sound was heard from behind us. This time just a few meters away, and this time, at the end of the whistle, someone called my name in a low voice. Jason. When I heard my name at the end of the whistling sound, my body froze. That voice was so natural that for a moment I truly thought someone who knew me was calling out. Ryan, without any hesitation, grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "Keep your flashlights down. Nobody look toward the sound," he said. The panic in his voice was clearer than I had ever heard before. When Noah wanted to turn around without understanding what was happening, Ryan stopped him too. "If you see it, you won't run." This sentence confused me even more. "See what?" I asked. Ryan didn't answer, he was just looking around. It was as if he was tracking something in the darkness that we couldn't see. A few seconds later, the whistle came again. This time it lasted longer. At the end, the same voice called Liam's name. Liam involuntarily turned his head toward the direction of the sound. We also instinctively looked at him. When the weak light of the flashlight fell between the trees, I saw something move there for a brief moment. It went behind a tree, but before it did, I could see that its height was much taller than a normal human. Its arms extended down to its knees. The strangest thing was that when it moved, the branches didn't shake. It was as if it wasn't walking on the ground. Ryan pouted his lips and whispered, "It's counting us." Noah got angry. "Counting what?" This time Ryan answered. "How many of us there are?" After these words, nobody spoke. We slowly began to retreat. The goal was to return to our camp. But after walking for about 10 minutes, the same old campsite appeared before us again. We all stopped. Liam looked around and said, "This is impossible." We went straight. I was thinking the same thing. We hadn't turned anywhere. Despite this, we were seeing the same rusty gas canister, the same rotted tent fabric, and the same wooden sign again. For the first time, Ryan admitted he was afraid. "The path has changed." Noah tried to laugh nervously. "A path doesn't change," Ryan answered without looking at him. "In a normal forest, it doesn't." At that moment, a faint light appeared from the direction of the lake. It was the direction of our camp. We were all overjoyed. We thought the campfire had been lit again. Hopeful, we started running toward it. When we emerged from the trees, we indeed saw our tents. The campfire was burning, but something wasn't right. Because 5 people were sitting around the campfire. I froze. Ryan too, Noah too, Liam too, because one of the people sitting by the fire was me, the other was Ryan, the other was Kevin, the other was Liam, and the other was Noah. They looked exactly like us. The same clothes, the same bags, the same movements. Even the person who looked like me threw wood into the fire, raised his head, and looked straight at where we were standing. A smile slowly appeared on his face. Then came a whistle, heard from very far away yet sounding right next to our ears. The 5 people sitting around the fire stood up at the same time, and without any of them taking a step, as if sliding, they began to come toward us. Ryan screamed for the first time, "Run!" And we began to run into the darkness of the forest for our lives. Hearing Ryan scream, nobody looked back. We all instinctively started running toward the depths of the forest. Branches scratched our faces, our feet tripped over stones, but no one stopped. Although the whistling sounds coming from behind us were heard one by one at first, a few seconds later, it was as if the whole forest started whistling. The same melody was coming from every direction. It was as if it was tracking us no matter where we ran. I was having trouble breathing, but Ryan was still running ahead of us and frequently shouting, "Turn right. Don't stop. Don't turn off the light." After running for about 15 minutes, we came across a narrow river. The depth of the water was a little above the knee. Ryan plunged into it without a second thought, and we followed after him. When we reached the opposite bank, he finally stopped and caught his breath. We all collapsed to the ground from exhaustion. The surroundings were completely quiet. The whistling sounds had vanished all of a sudden. It was the first time we felt relatively safe. I asked where Kevin was. We all looked at each other. No one answered, because at that moment we realized that Kevin had not been with us for more than half an hour. Liam stood up angrily. "We can't leave him there." Ryan lowered his head. "I want that too, but if we go back now, we will all disappear." Noah objected to this. "Maybe he is still alive." Ryan was silent for a long time, then said in a low voice, "I hope so." We decided to wait by that river until morning. Nobody slept. We flinched at every rustle of a leaf. Around 4 in the morning, the sky lightened a bit. Bird songs began to be heard. The forest looked normal again. Ryan stood up and said, "We will go back now. They don't appear during the day." Hearing this sentence, I asked again who the word "they" referred to. Ryan said his father had told him this years ago. Supposedly, in some old campsites, there's something that calls people by voice at night. Whoever answers or follows it is never the same after that night. I thought it was just an old legend, but after what we had seen in the last few hours, I could no longer deny anything. As the sun began to rise, we headed back toward the camp. Interestingly, this time it took only 20 minutes to find the way. The forest we had wandered through for hours during the night now looked completely ordinary. There was no old camp nor any wooden sign. It was as if none of them had ever existed. Finally, we reached the edge of the lake. Our tents were in place. The campfire was out. Everything looked as it did before, but Kevin was not there. His tent was open. His sleeping bag was left inside, his phone too, his wallet too. Even one of his shoes was at the entrance of the tent. It was as if he had disappeared in an instant. We immediately went toward the cars to inform the police. The phones still weren't getting a signal. About an hour later, when we hit the main road, we made our first call. The police, rescue teams, and Forest Service personnel searched the area that day. Kevin was not found. Even after searches that lasted a week, nothing was achieved. The official report stated that he went missing in the forest. About 3 months after the incident, Ryan called me. His voice sounded even worse than before. He said that while his father was cleaning out old boxes, he found a photo taken at that lake years ago. In the picture, his father and his friends were camping. When I saw the photo, my blood ran cold because in the background, among the trees, far away, 5 people were standing. One of them looked exactly like Kevin, and the date of the photo was 1989, but Kevin was born in 2000. Even though months had passed since the incident, none of us could return to our normal lives. The police questioned us repeatedly. They asked the same questions over and over again. They asked if we had argued with Kevin, if he had left the forest alone, or if he had used alcohol or drugs. But the answer we gave did not change. He had simply vanished. No blood trace was found, no piece of clothing, nor any piece of evidence regarding a wild animal attack. The forest had seemingly swallowed him. The old photo Ryan showed had made everything even stranger. We enlarged the picture several times and examined it carefully. One of the 5 figures standing in the background truly resembled Kevin. The same hairstyle, the same body build, even the expression on his face could be distinguished. But we knew this was impossible. When the photo was taken, Kevin was not yet born. When Ryan showed the picture to his father, he didn't speak for a long time. Then he said quietly that after that camp, a friend of his had also gone missing. Until then, he hadn't told anyone about it, because people wouldn't have believed him. Hearing these words, the blood froze in my veins. This meant that this incident was not happening to someone for the first time with us. Ryan's father told us one more detail. While searching for their missing friend, they had found an old, rotted wooden sign deep in the forest. The same sentence was written on the sign, "Whistle back and you stay." When I heard this, I stopped believing in coincidences altogether. 6 months passed. One evening when I returned home from work, I saw a small envelope with no sender in my mailbox. There was no letter inside, just a Polaroid photo. The picture showed our campsite by the lake. The campfire was burning. 5 tents were set up. I turned the picture over and looked at its date. The picture was taken 1 day after our camp. But the person who took this should not have been there. And the most terrifying part I saw when I carefully enlarged the picture. 5 people were sitting around the campfire. I recognized four of them: me, Ryan, Liam, Noah. The fifth was Kevin, but he wasn't looking at us. He was looking at the camera, and he was smiling. On the back of the picture, only one sentence was written: "We're still camping." After that night, I never camped in the forest again. None of my friends did either. Ryan sold all of his equipment. Liam moved to another state, and Noah leaves the room when this topic is brought up. None of us could fully explain what we saw that night. Perhaps there is no need to either. If one day you go to a campsite where your phone doesn't get a signal, whose name isn't even on the map, and you hear a whistling sound from inside the forest in the middle of the night, don't consider it just a joke. Even if you think someone is calling you, do not answer. Because sometimes the thing calling you knows who you are, knows your name, can mimic your voice. But it is not human, and if one day you see this sentence on an old wooden sign, whistle back and you stay. Get away from there without even looking back, because sometimes the forest doesn't kill people, it just keeps them. People often talk about hearing strange sounds at night when camping. Some think it's an animal, others say it's the wind playing tricks. For many years I thought so too, until one night when I heard a cry for help coming from an old radio device. The most terrifying part was that I recognized the voice of the person making that call later on, because when he was asking for help, he had already been considered dead for over 30 years. My name is Daniel Carter. This incident took place in November 2021. I was 30 years old, and together with Chris, my closest friend since childhood, we went camping every autumn. Both of us enjoyed unplugging from technology and spending a few days in the forest without using phones. That year, we decided to choose a different spot. On internet forums, we had found an old camping site located among the mountains that very few people talked about. According to what was written, hunters and fishermen used to use that area at one time, but in the last decade, almost no one went there. This sounded interesting to us. We thought the fewer people knew about it, the quieter it would be. We set out early in the morning. After driving for about 4 hours, the asphalt road ended and a narrow forest path began. The weather was cloudy. The leaves of the trees had already turned yellow and fallen. A dense pine forest stretched on both sides of the road. About half an hour later, we saw an old, rusted sign. The writing on it was almost entirely erased. Only one word could be made out: Black Creek. Chris joked that names like that are never a good sign. I laughed, and we continued on our way. About 10 minutes later, we reached a small clearing. A narrow river flowed through the middle of it. Old campfire sites were visible around. Rusted signs nailed to the trunks of some trees years ago were still in place. The interesting part, though, was that there was a small wooden cabin at the edge of the camping site. Its roof was rotted, the glass of its windows was broken, but its door was closed. It looked as if someone had deliberately locked it when leaving the place. Chris said we would check out the cabin after setting up our things. I agreed. Throughout the day, everything went normally. We set up our tents, tried to catch fish by the river, and lit a campfire in the evening. After it got dark, the temperature dropped rapidly. We were sitting by the campfire when Chris suddenly went silent. He had turned his head toward the other side of the river. I looked too. A faint orange light was visible among the trees. It looked as if someone was standing there with a flashlight. The light appeared for about 5 seconds, then it went out. Chris thought it was other campers, but it was strange, because on that side there was neither a road nor an official camping site. We watched for a while. The light did not appear again. Around 12 o'clock at night, we went into our tents. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. But the thing that woke me up in the middle of the night was not the wind, nor was it any animal sound. It was the static coming from an old radio device. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The static was coming so faintly that my brain tried to perceive it as the sound of the wind. But a few seconds later, the sound was heard again, and now I was sure it was a mechanical sound. I slowly unzipped the tent and looked outside. The campfire had gone out long ago. The sky was covered with thick clouds, and the moonlight was barely visible. The surrounding darkness was so dense that it was impossible to make out anything further than 5 meters away without a flashlight. And the static continued. When I listened carefully to the direction the sound was coming from, I realized it was coming from the old cabin at the edge of the camping site. Chris had also woken up. He too came out of his tent, walked toward me, and asked in a whisper, "Do you hear it too?" I nodded in confirmation. Both of us stood without speaking for a few seconds, listening to the sound. Then Chris said cautiously, "Maybe someone is in there." I thought that was impossible. We had wanted to check the cabin during the day, but changed our minds upon seeing that its door was locked with a rusty padlock. Looking inside through the windows, only dust-covered furniture was visible. There was no electricity line either. There couldn't be a functioning radio device in a place like this. Curiosity overcame fear. We took our flashlights and slowly walked toward the cabin. As we approached the wooden steps, the static could be heard more clearly. Then it suddenly cut off. At that exact moment, a man's voice came from inside. "If anyone hears this, answer." Chris froze. I too remained motionless where I stood. The voice was very weak, but it was heard clearly. I approached the door and called out, "Hello, is anyone inside?" No answer came. Just 2 seconds later, the radio crackled again and the man's voice continued, "Please, get us out of here. They come at night." Chris looked at me. The expression on his face was the exact replica of the fear I was feeling. He gently pushed the door. The rusty lock was still in place. The door didn't open. This meant the sound was coming from inside the locked cabin. I shone my flashlight through the broken part of the window. An old table, 2 chairs, and a large radio station covered in rust in the corner were visible. The interesting part was that the radio was actually working. The old green light on it was blinking. But there was no one in the room. Chris suggested going inside through the window. Although I hesitated, I agreed. He went inside first, then me. The boards creaked under our feet. The room smelled of years of dust and mold, and the radio was still crackling. When I approached it, the sound suddenly became clear. "Daniel, if you hear this." My heart seemingly stopped. Chris looked at me too. I stepped even closer to the radio. The voice came again. "Daniel, don't answer. They will hear you too." I stood frozen without touching the radio. Chris whispered, "Is that your name?" I nodded in confirmation. This time the radio didn't go silent. The man continued to speak as if barely catching his breath. "There were 3 of us. Chris is no longer here. You are next." Chris took a step back. A deathly silence fell inside the room. Then, at the same time, we both looked at the old metal plate on top of the radio device. The manufacturing date was written on it, 1988. And that model of radio had been completely discontinued from production in 1991. Chris looked at the radio for a long time and couldn't say anything. I was in the same state. My mind was trying to find a logical explanation for this. Maybe someone had installed a new system into the old radio. Maybe a signal was coming from another frequency nearby. But none of these explanations accounted for it knowing my name. Moreover, while mentioning Chris's name, the voice had said Chris is no longer here, even though Chris was standing right next to me, safe and sound. I moved closer to the radio and cautiously picked up the microphone. "Do you hear me?" I said. For a few seconds, only static came from the device. Then the same man's voice spoke very quietly. "Whatever you do, do not cross to the other side of the river before morning." Chris immediately approached the window and looked outside. "Why?" he shouted. The radio did not answer. Barely 5 or 6 seconds had passed when suddenly the temperature inside the room dropped noticeably. Our breath began to turn into vapor. When I wanted to touch the radio, the device turned off on its own. The green light vanished. The static cut off completely. It was as if that old apparatus, which had been working a few minutes ago, had never received electricity. We looked at each other and decided to spend the night in the tents without doing any further investigation. We left the cabin and locked the door just as before. On the way back, I felt that the forest was excessively quiet. There was neither wind nor the sound of insects. Even the flow of the river was heard more faintly than before. This silence was making me anxious. When I reached the tent, I looked at my watch. It was 02:43 a.m. It was impossible to fall asleep. About half an hour had passed when the faint light appeared again from the opposite bank of the river. This time it was closer than before. I unzipped the tent a little. Chris was already awake too. The light wasn't alone. Now 3 different lights were visible. All of them were moving slowly among the trees. It looked as if people holding old oil lamps in their hands were wandering inside the forest. Chris said in a low voice, "They are coming toward us." I looked closely. No, they weren't coming to us. They were standing at the edge of the river, and they seemed to be waiting to cross to the opposite bank. For a few minutes none of them moved, then all at once, all of their lights went out, the forest plunged into darkness again. At that exact moment the radio static was heard again from the cabin behind us. This time there was no man's voice, a woman's voice was coming. "Daniel," I held my breath. "Don't you dare look behind you." As soon as Chris heard this, he instinctively wanted to turn around. I grabbed him by the arm, because as the woman was saying her last sentence, her voice was no longer coming from the cabin, the voice was coming from right behind our tent. When the woman's voice came from behind the tent, my body turned to stone. A strong urge had arisen inside me to look back, but for some reason, I believed the warning I heard through the radio. Chris had held his breath too. On the other side of the thin fabric of the tent, a very faint rustling could be heard. It felt as if someone was slowly walking around the tent. The steps were so cautious that the ground made almost no sound. Then that woman's voice was heard again. This time it was quieter. "Daniel, it hears you?" I closed my eyes. I didn't say anything. Suddenly Chris whispered very quietly, "Look at the shadow of the tent." Without turning my head, I tried to look out of the corner of my eye. Even though it was weak, the moonlight was falling on the fabric of the tent. A shadow was visible on the fabric. At first, I thought it was a tree branch. But a branch doesn't breathe, and this shadow was moving slowly. Then a second shadow appeared, followed by a third. They were circling around the tent. I started counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The shadows didn't stop. They just continued to loop around. Chris was already trembling. He whispered, "We need to get out of here." Before I had a chance to answer, a sound was heard from afar. The sound of an engine. We both looked at each other. It was a car inside the forest at 3 in the morning. A few seconds later, the light of the headlights appeared among the trees. Someone was approaching the camping site along the old dirt road. When the car stopped, the door opened. A man's voice was heard. "Hello, is anyone here?" Chris stood up joyfully. Finally, I too breathed a sigh of relief. But at that exact moment, the old radio started up again. This time, the man's voice was screaming, "Don't go out." The voice was so loud that we froze where we stood. The radio continued. "They always come like this." Chris looked at me. The man outside called out again, "Forest Service, do you need help?" This sounded completely normal, but the man on the radio kept screaming like crazy. "Open the door, that's how they found us too," the man outside said in a calm voice again. "Daniel." When I heard my name, my blood ran cold. We hadn't told anyone our location when coming here, and our phones had lost signal hours ago. The man called out once more. This time he was closer. "Daniel, Chris, I've come to take you home." Chris leaned toward the tent and wanted to open the zipper. I grabbed his arm. At that exact moment, 2 old leather boots came and stopped at the entrance of the tent. But there was something strange inside the boots. There were no feet. Looking at the old leather boots standing at the entrance of the tent, my brain didn't want to accept what it was seeing. They looked as if they were on the feet of someone invisible. The boots were standing on the dirt, but there were no knees, body, or shadow, just 2 old hunter boots. For a few seconds they remained completely motionless. Then they slowly took a step forward. The dirt crunched under their feet, but there was still nothing visible. Chris couldn't hold his breath. In a very weak voice he said, "What is this?" At that exact moment, the man's voice coming from the radio spoke for the last time. "Turn off the lights." Without thinking at all, I turned off my flashlight. Chris did the same. The inside of the tent plunged into total darkness. Outside, only the sound of the wind was heard. A few seconds later, the sound of the boots' footsteps began to move away. They passed by the tent and went in the other direction. Then they vanished completely. For about 10 minutes, nobody spoke. Finally, the sky slowly began to light. The sound of birds was heard. It was as if everything that had happened throughout the night had suddenly ended. When we came out of the tent, the camping site looked just as it did before. We ran to the cabin. The door was still locked. I looked inside through the window. The radio was on top of the table we saw before, but it was completely covered in rust now. The dust was so thick that no one had touched it for years. The device whose green light was on last night now looked as if it hadn't worked for decades. Chris went inside through the window and approached the radio. Underneath it, There was an old notebook. The logo of the Forest Service was visible on the first page of the notebook. The date, October 14, 1991. We began to turn the pages. This was the diary of the radio operator working in that cabin. The first entries were ordinary weather reports, passage of hunters, fire warnings, but the last pages had changed. The words were written with a trembling hand. On one page it was written, "Voices come from the radio at night." At first I thought they were other stations. Then they started saying my name. And on the next page, Tom crossed to the other side of the river. He didn't return. In the last completed entry there was only one sentence. "If you are reading this notebook, do not answer when it calls you by your name at night." The last page of the diary had been torn out, but it was possible to read the ink marks left underneath the torn part. Two names were written there, the first, Thomas Reed, and the second, Daniel Carter. I dropped the notebook from my hand. This diary was written 10 years before I was born, and despite this, my name was already on the last page. I felt my hands trembling as I closed the diary. Chris wasn't saying anything. Both of us were trying to find a logical explanation for this, but every new detail made the situation even more incomprehensible. How could my name be in a diary written in 1991? How could that radio operator even know me? It was impossible for all of this to be a prank. The papers of the notebook were aged, its edges turned yellow. A part of the ink had already begun to fade. It didn't seem possible to fabricate these after the fact. We packed our things and decided not to stay in that place for a single minute longer. We got into the car and none of us spoke until we hit the main road. The interesting thing was that on the way back, the old Black Creek sign we saw earlier wasn't there. Only two broken wooden posts remained by the side of the road. It was as if there had never been a sign there. I stopped the car and checked the surroundings. There was no trace in the dirt showing that it had been pulled out of its place. After returning to the city, my first task was to conduct research about Black Creek on the internet. With great difficulty, I came across a small newspaper archive from 1992. The article stated that the old Forest Service radio station located in the mountainous area was closed after mysterious events. A landslide was given as the official reason. But at the end of the article, there was a sentence that caught my attention. Prior to the incident, 3 employees went missing, and only the radio operator's diary was found. I also learned the name of that operator, Samuel Harris. A few days later, I tried to reach his family. After long searches, I managed to contact his granddaughter. When I asked her questions about the radio station, she didn't want to speak at first. Then she said only one thing. My grandfather kept repeating the same sentence until the end of his life. I asked, "What sentence?" The woman was silent for a few seconds, then she answered, "If the radio calls you by your name, it is already too late." After these words, the phone cut off. I could never contact that family again. About 8 months passed since the incident. One evening, I was home alone. I was preparing food in the kitchen. Suddenly, a faint static sound was heard from the living room. I didn't have a radio in my house. The sound was coming from the television, and the television was turned off. As I approached, the screen opened on its own. Only a black and white fuzzy signal appeared ahead. Then that familiar man's voice was heard. "Daniel." I froze where I stood. The voice continued. "This time you survived because you didn't answer." The screen went black for a moment. Then, for just a single second, the old radio cabin appeared. A man was sitting behind the table. His face couldn't be made out. But he slowly raised his head, and I looked at my own face. The screen shut off immediately. Since that day, I never keep a radio in my house, and I don't touch devices working on old frequencies at all. Maybe there is some explanation for all of this. Maybe there isn't, but I know one thing for sure. If one day you find an old radio working in an abandoned cabin in the middle of the forest, and that radio says your name, never answer it, because sometimes that voice isn't asking for help. It's just looking for its next operator. People think that getting lost in the forest is the greatest danger, but I realize that sometimes the problem is not losing your way. The problem is finding a place that shouldn't exist. I was 26 years old when this happened. I had planned a 2-day camping trip with my friends. When the police found me at the end of the trip, I was alone. They questioned me for hours about what had happened, but they didn't believe a word of what I said. To be honest, I wouldn't have believed it either. Because the lake I saw that weekend is on no map, and the old watchtower I saw on the shore of that lake was destroyed by a fire 30 years ago, according to official records. My name is Nathan Cole. This incident took place in October 2023. My older brother Eric, our childhood friend Mason, and I had been planning a camping trip together for a long time. Eric was an experienced hiker, and Mason was a photographer whose main goal was to shoot autumn landscapes. As for me, I just wanted to get away from the city for a few days. The area we were going to was close to the border of the national park. We had chosen a small camping spot about 2 hours away from the official hiking trail. The weather forecast was good, so we weren't expecting any problems. The first day went completely normally. We set up our tents in the afternoon, prepared food by a small nearby river, and Mason took photos for hours. When evening fell, Eric opened his old paper map. On the edge of the map, drawn with a thin pencil, was a trail that wasn't on the official routes. Next to it, only 2 words were written: Mirror Lake. Mason thought it would be an interesting photo location. I asked why that lake wasn't on the phone maps or the official park map. Eric said this map had been given to him years ago by a retired park ranger. That man had said only one sentence: if you find the path, make sure to come back before sunset. We laughed it off, thinking it was just an old tourist legend. The next morning, we prepared early for just a one-day hike. Our plan was to find the lake, let Mason take his photos, and return to camp before nightfall. We walked through the forest for about 2 hours. Then the trail suddenly vanished, but in the dirt, fresh footprints began to appear. They were the prints of 3 people. The problem, though, we knew that no one else was heading in that direction but us. Mason was the first to see the footprints. He took the camera off his neck, knelt down, and began to look closely at the ground. At first, we thought the prints belonged to us, but Eric immediately said that was impossible. The direction of the tracks wasn't from where we had come. They came out of a deeper part of the forest and stretched straight ahead. When I looked closely, I noticed a strange detail. The footprints were very fresh. The moisture in the dirt hadn't completely filled back in yet. It looked as if those people had passed through here just a few minutes ago. We looked around. There was no one, no sound of talking could be heard, nor any snapping of branches. Only the faint howling created by the wind in the treetops was heard. Mason thought this was a good sign. He said that maybe other tourists had found the lake too. Eric, however, didn't agree. He looked at the size of the footprints and said something strange. There are 3 of them, but the steps are not spaced at the same distance. I asked him what he meant. He explained that normally, people walking together move with roughly the same rhythm. In these prints, the steps of the person in the middle were much longer than the others. It was as if he was leaping several meters ahead with every 2 steps. Still, we continued on our way. About 20 minutes later, the trees began to thin out. A calm lake appeared before us. The water was so motionless that at first glance it resembled a mirror. Mason was in awe. It's the calmest lake I've ever seen. I looked around. There wasn't a single bird. No insect sounds could be heard either. This was completely different from the previous forest. It was as if life itself didn't enter this area. On the other side of the lake, an old wooden watchtower was visible. Eric froze in his tracks. It's impossible. I asked him why he said that. He answered without taking his eyes off the tower. Ranger who gave me this map told me that this very tower burned down 30 years ago. 3 of us looked at the tower for a long time. Even though it looked old, it was completely intact. Even the glass of the windows in its upper section wasn't broken. Mason immediately pulled out his camera. He took a few pictures. Then he looked at the screen and furrowed his brow. Interesting. What happened? I asked. He held the screen out to me. The lake was visible in the pictures. The trees were visible, but the tower wasn't there. When we raised our heads, the tower was still standing right in front of us. But looking at the photo, it was as if nothing had ever been there. Mason thought it was a camera malfunction and took another picture, the same result. I took one with my phone too, again, the same. The tower was visible only to the naked eye. No device could record it right at that moment. I saw something move in the topmost window of the tower. It looked as if someone was watching us from behind the curtain. A few seconds later, the glass of the window was tapped slowly 3 times, thud, thud, thud. Yet there was a distance of at least 300 meters between us and the tower, and despite this, we heard those taps so clearly as if they were being struck right next to our ears. After the 3 taps coming from the tower window, none of us spoke. Mason slowly lowered his camera. It was the first time I had ever seen fear on his face. Eric, meanwhile, kept his eyes fixed on the tower. I had never seen him this tense before. About 10 seconds passed. Then the dark silhouette in the upper window of the tower slowly retreated and vanished. It was as if it had never been there. Mason said in a low voice that maybe there was a park employee inside. I reminded him that that was impossible. If someone were there, the tower would show up in the pictures. Moreover, the tower shouldn't even exist. Eric took a deep breath and decided that we would walk up to the shore, but we wouldn't approach the tower. The goal was only to understand why the lake wasn't on the map. We began to advance slowly along the shore. The strange thing was that no matter how much we walked, the tower didn't get any closer to us. At first glance, it appeared about 300 meters away. We walked for 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, but the distance didn't change. It was as if the tower was moving along with us. To prove this, Mason tied a bright orange ribbon on top of a large boulder on the shore. Then we walked for another 5 minutes. Looking back, that boulder wasn't there. Instead, the orange ribbon was once again on top of another boulder right next to our feet. None of us had picked it up, Eric said openly for the first time. This place is not normal, I agreed, because now it wasn't just the tower, the surroundings were changing too. Not a single wave formed on the lake. The wind was shaking the branches of the trees, but the surface of the water remained completely motionless. It was as if the lake wasn't made of water, but of glass. Mason knelt down and wanted to dip his hand into the water. The moment his fingers touched the water, ripples formed across the entire surface of the lake at the exact same time. But these ripples didn't start from his hand. On the contrary, they started from the very center of the lake. Then they spread rapidly toward the shore. It was as if something invisible in the middle of the lake had touched the water. We instinctively backed away at that exact moment. A long, rusty bell toll came from the tower, dong. The sound echoed through the entire valley. Then a second time, dong, and the third time. The sound of the bell was replaced by human footsteps. Someone was walking down the wooden stairs. The tower was so far away that normally we shouldn't have heard this sound. But we heard every step clearly: thud, 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 thud. Eric suddenly grabbed my shoulder. Nathan. His voice was trembling. Don't look at me. What's wrong? Just look at the lake. I slowly turned my head toward the lake. The surface of the water reflected us like a mirror, but our reflection wasn't right. The 3 of us were standing on the shore, but in the lake, 4 people were visible. The 4th person was standing right behind us, and in the reflection, he was slowly smiling. I instinctively wanted to turn around, but Eric grabbed my arm so tightly that I almost lost my balance. Don't look, he said. His voice was fainter than a whisper. If someone were truly behind us, we would hear their footsteps. This reasoning made sense. There was total silence behind us. No rustling of leaves, no snapping of twigs, not even the sound of breathing could be heard. Despite this, the 4th figure on the surface of the lake didn't move from its spot. Mason raised his camera again. I have to shoot this, he said. He pressed the shutter. When the picture opened, I felt my heart sink. Only the 3 of us appeared on the screen. The 4th figure was gone, but there was another strange detail. In the photo, the old watchtower was now visible among the trees behind us. Yet just a few minutes ago, no device could capture it. Eric took the camera from my hands. Then he slowly raised his head and looked at the tower. The tower was gone. The building that had been standing before our eyes just moments ago had seemingly vanished into thin air. Now, only empty trees were visible on the other side of the lake. Confused, Mason took another picture, and this time, the tower wasn't in the photo either. It was as if it had only appeared for a few seconds. Suddenly, from within the forest, not a whistling sound but the faint noise of an engine was heard. The 3 of us turned our heads at the same time. An old green pickup truck was emerging from among the trees. It had the National Park logo on it. The truck stopped next to us. A park ranger in his 60s got out. The moment he saw us, the color drained from his face. "Did you get here?" he shouted. Eric showed him the map. The moment the man looked at the map, his hands began to tremble. Then he tore the map up and threw it to the ground. "Take anything. Get in the truck right now." We tried to ask what was happening, but he didn't answer. He was just looking around in panic. Suddenly, his gaze stopped behind us. His face turned completely white. He whispered, "4 people again." I felt my blood run cold because we were only 3 people. The park ranger pointed behind us with a trembling hand. Nobody turned around. Then he stepped backward slowly. He opened the truck door. But he didn't get inside. Just without taking his eyes off the space behind us, he said, "If you've seen it in the water, it already knows you too." Right at that moment, I looked at the reflection in the rear window of the pickup truck. 4 people were indeed standing there, and this time, the face of the 4th person was clearly visible. It was me, but the smile on his face I had never made. When I saw my own face in the rear window of the pickup, my entire body went numb. That figure was in the same clothes as me, had the same hairstyle, but the expression on his face did not belong to me. He stood there with a calm and bizarre smile, like someone who had been waiting for me for long years. I instinctively blinked. When I looked back at the glass, the 4th figure had vanished. Only I, Eric, and Mason were visible. The park ranger immediately got us into the truck. As soon as he started the engine, he folded the rearview mirror. When I asked the reason for this, he said only one sentence: "In this forest, you must not look at certain things a second time." There was such determination in his voice that none of us asked any more questions. For about 20 minutes, nobody spoke. When we finally hit the main road, the man took a deep breath and stopped the truck. He told us that he had been working in this park for over 30 years. There are some places that are not on the official maps, and nothing is told to new employees about those places, because curiosity drives people there, but fear often cannot bring them back. Then he added that the name of the lake we went to was never Mirror Lake. Among themselves, the park workers used to call it the Second Shore. When asked why, he replied, "Some people who go there come back, but they aren't always the exact same people." After hearing these words, none of us spoke. A few days after returning to the city, Mason transferred all the photos he had taken to his computer. He called me and asked me to come to his house urgently. Judging by his voice, he was seriously frightened. When I reached him, he pointed to the monitor. He began to open all the photos taken at the lake one by one. The first pictures were normal. Then came the photos where the tower wasn't visible. After that, he opened the very last picture. None of us remembered taking this photo. It was as if someone had taken our picture with our own camera. In the photo, Eric, Mason, and I were standing on the shore of the lake. We weren't looking at the camera. We were all looking at the lake. But the strangest thing, in the lower right corner of the photo, there was an old date stamp 17 OCT 1993, yet the incident had taken place in 2023. We enlarged the picture on the other side of the lake. The ruins of the burned watchtower were visible, and next to the ruins, 4 people were standing. I recognized 3 of them, but the face of the 4th couldn't be made out because he was holding the camera. Mason wanted to delete that photo immediately, but the file wouldn't delete. He formatted it, it still remained. He changed his computer. A week later, the picture reappeared on the new computer. In the end, he destroyed all the memory disks. Despite this, a few months later, I received an email. There was no sender. In the attachment, there was only one picture, the exact same picture. This time, only one sentence was written underneath it: "See you on the second shore." After that day, neither I, Eric, nor Mason ever went camping again. I no longer research roads that aren't on maps, and I don't even watch videos about abandoned watchtowers anymore, because sometimes certain places aren't hidden from people. On the contrary, people are kept away from those places. If one day while walking in the forest you find a calm lake that doesn't appear on any map, and the surface of the water looks back at you like a mirror, don't look at it for too long, because sometimes the reflection you see in the lake is not your reflection. And if your reflection is one person too many, it is already too late.